it's a good conversation.
Right.
People generally are a bit more open. We're using this.
Hi. Sorry.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I'm joined by the usual suspects, Jamie and Iain from Light Reading. And this week we're going to be talking about diversification. We're going to be talking about Chinese vendors continually getting in trouble with the Americans and their allies. We're going to be talking about European operator consolidation, and hopefully we'll have time to chat a little bit about potential 5G aggro coming down the line. Just to remind you that if you're listening to the podcast, you can watch it on the website or on YouTube or in the cinema. Facebook. Or on Netflix. And if you're watching it, you can listen to it on SoundCloud or iTunes or also on the website.
It's called Fantastic Beasts at the cinema, yeah?
Oh, by the way, we went and saw that latest Fantastic Beast.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's really
Johnny
boring.
Depp is not making a comeback.
Oh,
No, man.
everybody's going on about wanting to go and see it.
No,
so
I went and
won't
saw it
then.
with the kids. The kids were bored. I was literally falling asleep.
Oh, dear.
Oh my god.
So I don't recommend it.
Okay.
They've really dropped the ball on that one, in my opinion.
Easy there, Kermode.
Yes, exactly. Just need my little... What's that thing he always wears? Anyway. Jamie, so I've been off all week, by the way, so you're going to be mainly getting me being a sort of passive asking questions rather than providing my usual level of awesome insight. But Jamie, you went to an event called the Great Telecoms Debate, was it?
Yeah.
Earlier on this week. How did
Great
that go?
telco debate.
The telco debate.
Yeah, it was good. It's good. It's a good format for an event, and basically Chris is run by a guy called Chris Lewis, who runs an analyst firm called Lewis Insight.
Yeah, I know Chris.
And it's basically, you don't take it too seriously. It's a good conversation.
Right.
People generally are a bit more open. We're using this.
Hi. Sorry.
Shall we lock it?
You're the top one.
There we go. Sorry about that. Someone just knocked on the door to the studio. We need to put on that little light
Yeah.
that says off.
But
Where were
it's
you?
basically Chris Lewis is trying to sort of drum up business for his analyst agency, and I suspect, you mentioned, Iain, that heavy reading are banned from going. So yeah,
Well, I don't
why
think
not?
he likes other analysts going.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. So it's a sort of general competitive snarling sort of thing.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. There weren't any other analysts there. There were other press there, but there weren't any other analysts.
Right. Okay.
But it was good, and it's a good format. Get a couple of experts or a couple of industry people on stage, and then him and one of his partners, they sort of debate. They both argue for and against the points, and one of the original points was, and it was of overwhelmingly in favour, is should telcos diversify or should they focus on the knitting, as they called
Right.
it, their core business of connectivity.
Yeah. Or plumbing, as I call
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Should they be connectivity businesses or should they continue and diversify?
Yeah.
And obviously the resounding answer was yes, they should diversify. But it's a massive. But one thing that
But
was
they're not very
pointed
good at
out,
doing it.
they're not very well. They're not very good at doing their own business. Ultimately, you've got to
poor old
say,
operators.
yeah. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say.
Shots
How
fired.
do you diversify when you're not very good
Yeah.
at doing your core business?
Sort your life out first, son.
Yeah, exactly.
Jordan Peterson would approve of the message.
Well, yeah. Should you look at some groovy things like banking or energy services or content or anything along those lines when you haven't actually finished the 4G rollout? 4G isn't everywhere in the UK. It's got patchy signal. Fibre, there's, broadband is suspect in sort of some rural communities, and that's only in the UK.
It's all the government's fault.
Yeah, it's all the government's fault. But that's only in the UK. When you go to other countries like Germany, it's even bloody worse. So that's the big question. How do you actually diversify when the core business?
But is one of the reasons some of the core stuff is because they think they've reached a point of diminishing returns when it comes to things like rural connectivity and that sort of thing, and they just don't think there's the ROI on it. whereas they think there might be better margin, better returns on diversifying.
Yeah, I mean that's the case, but that's still not a reason.
No,
you
it's
can't. You're trying to diversify and do other things when you haven't finished your your core mission. Ultimately. So,
but what if they focus? I'm just being devil's advocate here. What if they focus entirely on getting their core thing right, and then meanwhile all these cliches like the OTTs eating their lunch and all that sort of thing, and commoditization and shrinking ARPU, all these macro trends continue to happen?
I mean, that's the dilemma, and that's that's what sort of I sort of called it. It's the diversification dilemma. They're not, ideally you sort out the core business, but ultimately you can't wait to sort out the core business because, can the telcos survive another G that went down the route of 4G?
Mm-hmm.
Billions were spent rolling out 4G networks, and arguably, how much of a return did the operators get?
Yeah,
I mean, arguably the OTTs collected all the profits.
A lot of the benefit. Yeah.
So it was just an interesting point. It was just an interesting point. Yeah.
The trouble is it's a sort of saturated market now, so it's not dissimilar to problems that face other organisations in different sectors where they start to branch out into. I mean, look at supermarkets going into banking. It's the desire to find a new growth opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah.
Telcos have done a pretty good job, I think, of getting everybody equipped with smartphones and making broadband a kind of mass market phenomenon, but there's no growth left to be had in that area. So and experience has shown that as Jamie says, you roll out a new generation of technology like 4G or whatever it might be, and this is going to happen with 5G probably, and they're not going to make any more money on it because they're just selling services to the same people for the same prices basically, or there might be some uptick at first when you have early adopters coming in and taking more expensive tariffs, but eventually competition will
and
push
consumer
down the prices.
expectation with telecoms is to get more for less,
and I just don't think you can expect somebody to spend more. I mean, prices are going down all the time. You get MNOs coming along, these deals like GIF-GAF and whatever, 20 gigabytes a month for 15, 20 quid or whatever it might be. They're just not going to be able to make additional money from providing a new generation of technology, and that's why there's talking about doing things like banking or TV is another one, whatever it might be. And this is why there's this hope that 5G might open up new opportunities with vertical markets, as I like to call them.
Well, this is one of the points that was made yesterday as well, is about AI, and it was is there, and this is a big bugbear of mine, that the focus is too narrow from R&D perspective in telcos. They're something like so Adit from Tractia, he quoted, I was at a conference the other week and he quoted some stats, and he said 60% of all telco R&D and AI is being spent on network optimization.
Right.
Now that's all well and good, but if you focus it's such a narrow focus of sort of R&D investment on a single segment of AI, you're missing out on all the applications and all the value which can be generated from all the other levels. In industry specific applications or sort of like customer engagement and personalization and applying. It's too narrow and too focused, and part of that is perhaps down to the leadership team, and maybe that's why they're not very good at diversification as well.
They haven't got diverse people.
Well, you've got business managers in charge.
Right.
You haven't got technologists or innovators in charge of these companies. Like he's boring, but Nadella over at Microsoft. Ultimately, the reason they transitioned to this cloud business so successfully, I think one of the big reasons is Nadella is a cloud person.
Yeah.
He comes from that background, and he could lead the business. And you look at the telcos. I mean, what they got? Vodafone's got an accountant in charge. BT's new CEO isn't even from a telco background.
WorldPay, isn't it?
WorldPay,
yeah.
What's WorldPay do again?
It's kind of some kind of financial service, isn't it? That's
right.
connected
Sort
with
of
mobile
PayPal type of
technology,
thing.
I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you haven't got the relevant people in charge of the business, how can you diversify successfully?
Yeah.
Because all you're going to do is
this is a problem, isn't it? Trying to get people into the organisation and this is linked with the whole trying to make the core business a bit more, sexy itself and more efficient and more looking more like the web kind of networks that have been built, and they just can't. I think the trouble is that they find it quite hard to attract those kinds of people.
Yeah,
because they want to go off and work for Google or Facebook or the new Google or Facebook. They don't want to go and work for an old former state-owned monopoly. You know?
Certainly not. And as you were just alluding to earlier, there's some kind of vague hope that 5G...
And they don't pay enough.
Yeah, well,
I think the average salary at Facebook's about 200,000.
Yeah, I wonder
Probably
how long
isn't
that's
that
going to keep
BT.
up, as long as they keep dropping the ball.
Well, that might change.
But yes, no, they're not short of a bob. That's very true. So yes, they can't get into a straight up toe-to-toe sort of arms race for talent with these companies, and that's all fine. That is a further dilemma, further to what Jamie was saying.
I think that's the massive issue, actually. I think it's the big, and it's a bit of a cliche as well. You go to conferences and they go, "Oh, it's not the technology, it's the cultural change."
Yeah.
But what it boils down to is how the hell do they get the staff in? If you're coming out of university as a really bright young thing who's done some kind of software engineering degree, and do you want to go and work for a former sort of state-backed telco, or do you want to go and work for a sexy new internet company?
So you're saying like Facebook's like about 200 grand?
Apparently, average salary at Facebook's 200 grand.
Well, I think we're pretty
wild.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think we're.
I think pretty much most of their stuff
US
in the
dollars,
US, aren't they? So US dollars.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think we're pretty open-minded and innovative, us in this room, and I'd settle for about 150k or something.
Yeah.
That'll do me.
I'd be happy with that.
I'll tighten my belt a bit. A couple less holidays, but I'll get by. Cool. And
Iain would have to take a pay cut for that.
Yeah, that's all right. I don't
wish.
mind taking one for the team. 150k. There we go. And another thing they could do, Iain, is a little segue here. Another little thing operators could do if they fail to innovate and they still are worried about margins is they could consolidate, couldn't they?
They could.
We were at this Huawei event the week sort of last week.
Yeah.
And you and I both chatted to an industry consultant called Bengt Nordstrom, and he's a consistent theme of his is that he thinks that
he's quite right wing on sort of economically.
yes, if we can apply sort of political wings to telecoms, and he thinks that the operators should be allowed to consolidate more.
Yeah.
He's talking specifically within Europe.
Yeah.
Than the European Commission. The European Commission seems to have this arbitrary 4-player target, doesn't it?
Has done, yeah.
Yeah, it always denies that this is a target, but its behaviour has always been to resist any reduction in number from 4 and to encourage any increase in number from 3. So to me, that says they like 4.
I think the weird thing is when they have allowed consolidation to happen, they've always attached pretty stringent conditions to deals. So when it happened in Italy, for example, it was like, well, they're allowed to players to consolidate, but they were forced to sell assets to a new player.
Yeah, and you've got to create, what was it, Iliad?
And that's Iliad, which is probably the worst kind of player you want coming in if you're trying to keep competition down to a minimum because they're so aggressive.
Quite.
So it's now probably the most competitive market in Europe.
So yes, indeed. And presumably they were going to start crying like the French did when Iliad did. Yeah. That was Iliad as well.
I think they already are. I think if you look at Windtray's results, which are out this week,
they're
pretty shocking.
Right.
And they've had other issues to do with some of the Chinese vendors.
Indeed.
Which we can come on to. But
another good segue. Keep that segue.
Jamie and I wrote about this, which was the big move this week. Sort of bit of a change in sentiment, it seemed. I think we both thought of it that way, was the approval of this merger in the Netherlands between...
Seems like they're softening their position on it, doesn't it? Yeah, because, I mean, that this is, as far as I'm aware, the only deal of this nature where there haven't been any conditions attached, because it is just literally
and what's the news, remind me?
So it's Tele2 has sold its Dutch business to Deutsche Telekom.
Right.
So T-Mobile Netherlands and Tele2 Netherlands will merge into a single entity.
So that is reducing the number of MNOs from 4 to 3.
And there's no conditions about asset sales or anything like that.
Yeah, and it's quite an about turn, because a few weeks ago they came out with this big statement of objections.
Right.
And it was reported on at the time. They kind of wrote to Deutsche Telekom and said, you need to, expressing all these worries basically about going down to 3-player market. And Deutsche Telekom really complained a lot at the time. And it sounds like they've kind of listened, which is a bit of a surprise, I guess, because they, as Jamie says, there's no obligations at all attached to it.
Yeah.
It's not like you have to provide a chunk of capacity on that network to MVNOs, which is what they did in Germany, I think, when E+ and Telefonica merged.
They did point out that there are quite a few MVNOs in the Netherlands, but I mean, I don't think they have any material impact on the sort of the competition. And they did state that I mean, this is the thing. I suspect, if there might be, if there's any operators out there getting excited about potentially buying a competitor. I mean, I don't think the same thing can be applied to the UK, for instance, because you look at Three as the fourth player in the UK, and what's it have?
Well, they tried to do it already, didn't they?
Yeah, they tried to buy
down
O2 ages ago.
I
But
don't know if they'd return to that attempt again.
I don't think they would allow it, because if you look at what is market share of Three, 15%.
Yeah, something like that.
About
I think
15%.
Maybe a bit less.
If one of the other major players bought Three, for instance, that 15% market share would have a material impact on the market standings. So, for instance, if Vodafone bought Three and absorbed that they would leap to being number one in the market again.
Yeah.
But at least, with this merger in the Netherlands, combining the two entities still keeps T-Mobile in third place. But admittedly, it grows it to about 25% market share.
I think the other odd thing about it, as the companies have pointed out, was that Tele2 already is a big customer of T-Mobile. It relies kind of heavily on its network.
I see.
I think as a sort of MVNO
within Holland.
proposition within Holland. Yeah.
Right.
So it was already a big MVNO client on T-Mobile's network.
So Tele2 doesn't have any of its own.
I don't know if it doesn't have any of its own
gear.
infrastructure, but it was a big customer, a big wholesale customer.
Because I don't know. I don't
T-Mobile's.
know. It's amazing. Just 1 week of just slobbing around at home, and I've forgotten everything.
I think it was a network operator, but it was also a big wholesale customer.
But maybe not a very big network, so it had to rely on third-party help.
It is an MNO. It's not an MVNO.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
But whereas in the UK, for instance, O2 and
Vodafone.
Three. O2 and Three are completely separate sort of.
Yeah, they've even got different network sharing deals, which is one of the problems, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And when we chat to Bengt about it, he's just like, he just can't see the competition problems from there being three. I mean, if you extrapolate it,
he's not been particularly. I mean, you're giving a lot of credit to Bengt there. He's not been particularly original. I mean, a lot of people say consolidation.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's solely Bengt's idea. I'm just saying it because both Iain and I have chatted to him recently, and this is a consistent theme of his when he chats to us. That's all. But no, I'm not saying it's unique to him at all. But the interesting thing about that is, I think we accept that obviously one player is a monopoly. We accept that a duopoly is probably not good, because there's just too many opportunities for a duopoly for there to be cartel behaviour and for them to sort of collaborate and help each other out. There we are. Yes, I like my Adam Smith.
You like your Adam Smith, yeah.
I can't quite memorise the quote anyway. I could be really poncy and sort of.
You did remember it when we met Bengt, I think.
I threw that
impressed everybody with your Adam Smith quote.
And so if one's very bad, two's quite bad, then you got to ask whether there's a linearity where it keeps getting better the more and more competition. And obviously, as Bengt would argue, and I agree with him, when you get to excessive competition, it becomes impossible for anyone to significantly invest or grow because they're constantly firefighting. So it's that investment threshold. Now I think operators crying.
It's a capital intensive industry, isn't it? So if you're Three and you've got, as Jamie says, 15% market share, but you've still got to build a nationwide network, you're trying to do that with a much smaller amount of revenue than BT is or Vodafone.
I think some of the crying about investment's a bit disingenuous, because they'd still manage to pay nice dividends and make decent profits and all that sort of thing.
I don't take that sort of extreme position on European consolidation. I think, and I'm not wholly convinced to the extent that Bengt is, that there's a massive problem in Europe in terms of networks kind of being a long way behind those in the US, for example. They often get compared to that. I mean, if you talk to some of the operators, can't mention names because people have sort of said this to me on background, but certainly senior executives at some of the really big operators think that comparison is very unfair, and they kind of point out that if you go to the US, you get pretty patchy coverage in a lot of places. Quality is often not very good.
It's ridiculously priced,
and it's also this is the thing. I mean, Bengt was saying this, that you do pay a lot more, but his take was that the kind of benefit is that investment's going into 5G networks a lot more quickly there than it is in Europe, and it's high charges that are allowing operators.
Well,
to do
that's the
basic investor against the consumer sort of angle, isn't it? I guess, but.
And
I don't buy that argument.
No, I'm not.
And the other problem is just that how the shareholder system works. PLCs are under constant pressure to deliver short-term returns to their shareholders. So that's that's a bigger disincentive to invest, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because shareholders, if you say we're investing, which means that we'll be in better shape in 20 years, shareholders, I don't care. I want my return this quarter.
Yeah.
So there are lots of other disincentives to invest.
But I think one it sort of raises the issue of how many networks do you actually want? Because you can have lots of players and lots of competition, but not necessarily have lots of networks.
So maybe
just create a nationalised network
Well,
and have
this-
loads of MNOs.
NBN.
Exactly, yeah.
sort of
I mean,
thing.
that's the extreme model, but certainly I think duplicating 5G infrastructure and
Yeah.
building. I mean, and we can see this happening now, even with companies in Europe talking about pooling assets. I think this is happening in Italy with Telecom Italia and Vodafone. I think are talking about pooling their 5G assets to build some kind of shared 5G network.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it makes sense in principle.
Fibre and Telecom Italia on the fixed side. So
But there you get into, we were sort of shoehorning politics into telecoms. There you get into the sort of collectivist versus individualist thing. So in principle, the collectivism always seems like a great idea. We all pull in the same direction. It's much more an efficient use of resources. But in practice, you look at NBN in Australia. I know this is fixed line.
yeah,
But you look at places where they've tried a sort of state-run approach.
I don't think it has to be state-run necessarily.
Right.
The problem
I-
is that generally when if you put public sector people in charge of anything, they invariably do a worse job.
Yeah,
If they were any good, they wouldn't work for the public sector. They'd work for the private sector.
So then how do you, Ian, coordinate it? If it's not the public sector involved, how do you coordinate private enterprise all collaborating on the same thing? It almost feels like they wouldn't do it unless the public sector was involved. Otherwise,
well, you could have a privately owned wholesale network that offers capacity on its network. I mean,
but
City
who
Fibre,
builds this network?
Well,
Where do the funds?
City Fibre's doing
Yeah.
that, and that's Goldman Sachs is one of its backers.
Right.
So there's money there.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. If big VC
what
type
if
places.
if that vehicle lives up to expectations, it's going to be 5 million properties by 2025, and then beyond that, who knows?
Fair
It
enough.
could be you're getting into the stage where you're talking about a massive chunk of UK homes. If you had another City Fibre coming along serving other areas, and there are already companies like Hyperoptic, I think, that are all focused on sort of rural areas, then I don't see why it couldn't.
I don't know how
necessarily
they
happen.
managed to run their business, because I've been to a few conferences over the last couple of weeks, and
Hyperoptic?
and the CEO it seems to be speaking in every conference.
Right.
She just spends more time at conferences than she does in her office. So don't know. So Hyperoptic, how are you running your business?
Why don't you come and speak about it? Send your CEO over.
Well, she clearly doesn't like being in the office, so she might as well come here.
She might as well come here. Okay. We're recording this on a Friday morning, and we've all got important lunches to go to. So I'm gonna move things along. So we're talking about building out networks. Another forced segue here, Ian. One set of network providers that might not be involved in the West will be Chinese ones. That keeps happening. It just keeps coming up.
Yeah.
This whole are Chinese vendors too dodgy security-wise to be involved in Western 5G networks? Obviously, I don't have a strong opinion on it myself, not being an engineer. But the political climate seems to be increasingly hostile to them.
Yeah.
So, I've written about rumours that the US is actively briefing against Huawei and ZTE with allied governments. One of the reasons it gave is, if we're going to have a US Army base there and they're going to be chatting on their phones, we don't want the Chinese to be able to intercept their chat.
Yeah.
And then this week, I think I'll hand it over to you guys. You first, Jamie, because I think your story was earlier. There've been
I think it's so bloody lazy.
No, I think yours is a different story. I'm going to get him to talk about ZTE. I'm going to get you to talk about the New Zealand thing.
Yeah.
So what's happened in New Zealand this week?
So it's basically Spark. So there's some sort of Kiwi legislation which states that all the operators have to get a thumbs up and an OK from the New Zealand government before they sort of lay any infrastructure down. So they applied for to put some 5G Huawei 5G RAN kit into their network, and it got slapped down by the regulator on the grounds of security.
Right.
To be honest, at the moment they haven't really said why.
Right, just security in general.
Yeah. I mean, just
It's
security.
I mean, I think they even said in their statement, Spark sort of said we haven't really had a full explanation or haven't.
And Huawei's
figured it out
written
yet,
said
but-
why can you actually be more
They
specific?
don't like the design of the box.
WTF
It's too menacing.
response.
But even the minister in charge, I don't know what his name is, but the minister in charge of this department went on national TV and he sort of explained his position and the decision, and he just didn't really say anything.
It's just vague.
Yeah, no, he just didn't say anything. He just generic security
Yeah.
concerns.
So it could
He
well
said
be this US diplomatic drive that's
Well, yeah,
behind
but
it.
he said this
they've
isn't.
never had evidence, have they? Anyway, it's all been based on the possibility of
Yeah.
it happening because they've got close links to the Chinese government. Because
Yeah,
any
which is the
Chinese
general
company
thing.
has close links to the Chinese government. It's what happens over there, isn't it? It's state
Well,
capitalism.
that's the inference. I mean, Huawei, it must be stressed.
I think
Always say that we got no links to the Chinese government at all.
well, yeah.
And then
But could they fully say what's wrong with it, or that would be classified? You know what I mean?
Well, the generic
do.
the generic concern is that because China is a statist country, that the state can poke its nose into the business of any company that's based there, which in the case of telecoms companies would be for it to ask them to sort of put little back doors to enable espionage and that sort of thing into telecoms gear.
Yeah, but I'm saying, could there be anything but vague? Like, could they really say, "Oh, this is what's in it. This is what's
Oh, I
wrong"?
see. Yeah, possibly.
That could
possibly
be classified. They wouldn't be able.
Oh, you
to
mean the
say
actual
much.
details of?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is the thing, though, isn't it? There's never actually been any evidence of it happening. So how can you sort of release information about something that hasn't happened?
I'm just saying.
I mean,
We don't know
the
what's happening
closest
behind
that's
closed
come to
doors.
that actually is this UK Cyber Security Evaluation Centre, where they flagged vulnerabilities, and they did go into some detail in a report earlier this year
Yeah,
about equipment being,
but that was bad engineering more than anything
they
else.
said it was bad engineering.
Because
Yeah.
they said that the big issue was that I can't remember what bit of kit it was, but essentially they were using open source software
Yeah.
where the support for that code was expiring in
That's it.
2020,
Yeah.
but the product had been designed to go through to like 2025 or something like that. So
Yeah.
they were putting a code they were using code which wouldn't have any support in the long run.
But that doesn't mean Huawei is necessarily more vulnerable than other vendors in that respect. It's just you don't have an Ericsson cybersecurity evaluation centre that's run by the government with a load of, government people digging around and looking at what's going on. Because they don't think there's a risk there because Ericsson's a friendly Western
So it comes down to
company,
political
so-
distrust of the Chinese state and of
It's
the
white
Communist
privilege.
Party.
Who's scared of the Swedes anyway?
Well, exactly. Everyone trusts
Yeah,
the
even though
Swedes.
they make a lot of stuff
As
in
we know,
China.
it's a lovely socialist utopia. What's not to like?
They love America.
But yes. So that's that, and I think that's just going to keep. I think that's just going to keep happening. I think they're in a bit of a bind there. As you know that. I imagine this happens in parallel with sort of trade aggro with China and general sort of big, most important country in the world chest beating between the US and China that goes on, a bit like it was between the US and Russia back in the 80s or whatever.
Well, I think that it's the backdrop is the kind of tech war that's brewing between
As
the
well.
US and China, isn't it? That's what this all boils down
But
to.
also
that-
Chinese mercantilism, the way they run their economy to try and hedge their bets in their favour.
Yep.
That's what Trump's been ranting about. Whether or not you're sympathetic to his rants is another
Yeah.
matter.
No, totally, and I think the tech side of that is a huge part of it because it's pretty clear that technology is going to rule the world. Yeah.
So on that note, so we've had ZTE has had several strikes by US government, all largely related to the US government having this list of countries you're not allowed to even look at if you want to do business with the US. And the one it got in most trouble with earlier in this year, which nearly brought about its demise, was Iran.
Yeah.
And now you've just written something, and then I wrote about it, having seen you writing about it this morning, about Venezuela. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so they two of the senators that have regularly gone after ZTE have I think Marco Rubio and Chris Van
Marco
Hollen.
Rubio, who likes to retweet light reading.
He does, yeah. They've gone after ZTE again and asked for an investigation into sales in Venezuela, basically. And what they're saying is, I think there's several things. They're kind of suspicious that I think Reuters itself actually claims to have kind of documentary evidence that.
So we've both been relying on Reuters for this story.
We have, yes. It's a Reuters scoop, but they say ZTE's basically sold equipment in Venezuela that contains Dell components.
Yeah.
Dell being a US technology company. But also there's, the very fact that you're working with the Venezuelan government on, I think what it was supposed to be was some kind of database for monitoring citizens would also perhaps be in violation of some human rights kind of
I think
laws.
they've put Venezuela on a list because it's so horrible to its own citizens, and this was a national ID card thing, which is very, very sort of Cold War, Eastern Bloc,
But
Big Brother sort of stuff.
But if this does lead to, I mean, if it does prompt another investigation, which is kind of hard. I mean, if Reuters has fairly compelling evidence about them doing something that's clearly in breach of violations,
like, how many
it's
times
pretty hard to argue against there being an investigation.
Yeah.
And if that leads to another components ban or other penalties, I think it's the end for ZTE.
But the problem is that they deal with businesses. They deal with countries that, I mean, that's their business model.
Yeah.
You know, they deal with countries that...
They deal with dodgy countries.
Yeah, no, not dodgy countries, but the countries that the major players don't
the
want
long
to deal
tail.
with.
Yeah.
So
the geographical long tail.
You know, the ones that they scoop up everything that's fallen through the Swiss cheese model. Nokia's had a look at it, Ericsson's had a look at it, Huawei's had a look at it. Okay, this is what's left, and that's ZTE's business model. But more often than not, there's a reason that those companies don't want to go after those contracts, and maybe it's because they're not commercially viable.
I think they'd be all right doing it, but the trouble is that they're so heavily reliant on US components, and unless they can change that, and it's not something they can do overnight, because I don't think a lot of those component makers are companies like Acacia, and they don't have equivalents apparently.
So you looked into that a fair bit the last time.
So trying to re-engineer your supply chains and get them from elsewhere just isn't kind of a short-term option. It would take the Chinese a long time to build.
And you can bet they're working on it, but it takes a long time. So I think every time that you get in trouble, they normally end up sacking a bunch of people. I think the people they should sack are their compliance people. I mean, surely they've got a massive department.
I think they do, don't they? They've kind of had to install new ones as a result of.
I know, but what are they doing? I mean, unless the US hasn't been clear. But if the US has laid down look, ZT, if you deal with any of these countries, you're in.
Yeah.
Then it can't be very complicated to not deal with those countries.
Yeah.
So do they? I mean, surely they can't think they're going to get away with it.
Maybe you're not dealing with those countries. You're basically not doing any business anymore.
Well, yes.
You look at where ZTE is strongest. It's the regions, Africa and South America, and China. Obviously.
I mean, there's probably quite a few. There's probably quite a lot of countries
like
on this kind of list, I guess. Places that you shouldn't be.
So you seem to be inferring that the only way ZTE can continue to.
I'm not saying
do business is to piss off the Yanks.
No, I don't know if that's the case, but I think it's if you've got deals with countries that the US doesn't want you dealing with, and you're using US components in your equipment, that's the big problem. Is how to get those US components out and use something else instead. And I don't think there's a. Is there an alternative?
Surely they could have flogged some moody Chinese space data center to Maduro, who wouldn't presumably know one end of a data center from another.
Yeah, I mean they've had two big penalties, two big fines in the last couple of years. And sort of managed to bounce back from them. But I think another one would. I mean, certainly.
I agree.
The sentiment from people that I spoke to when I was at a recent ZTE event. Was that their customers are kind of looking at them warily. Customers in Europe that use them, and 3 strikes, I think, and you're out. Yeah.
Well, I think 3 strikes. So I actually used the strikes metaphor when I wrote it up. I think they had their 3rd strike earlier on this year, but they just managed to rescue themselves. I think this is a 4th strike if they get found.
Well, 4th strikes,
then they're in stuck.
But I just think if this does lead to an investigation, there's more penalties. I think that's it for them. They're finished.
It's a worrying development for them, so we'll be keeping close eye on that. Okay, we're nearly running out of time. I want to cover one other thing that you've written about. I haven't actually read your story, but I've been chatting to you when you were thinking about it, because I get this privileged access to the incredible telecoms mind that is Iain Morris.
They built it up now into something.
No, I mean it's technical, but it's very relevant. I'm not going to paraphrase it, but it's something to do with some potential sort of technical problems within 5G. So tell us.
Well, it's on the light reading site, and it's probably better read than explained because it is technical.
You're just telling me to drop it?
No, not at all. No. So basically, we did some digging around and found that there's a specs issue where the latest version of the 5G specifications, which came out in September, have changes in them that aren't backwards compatible with earlier releases.
Right.
Which is stuff that came out in March and June. And again, it sounds technical.
It sounds
why
good.
would that
So you're
matter?
saying that if someone's worked towards the current specs, something's going to come along that's going to render some of their work obsolete.
Well, the issue, as we understand it, is that device makers at the moment, like people who make chipsets for devices, are basing their work on the September specs. Those are considered to be the ones that are the kind of hard commercial version of 5G. For the initial 5G
and you
smartphones.
need that. Obviously, you need that kind of certainty.
Yeah. And if all the gear that is being sold was also based on those specs, it wouldn't be an issue. But a lot of base stations have been shipped by the big equipment vendors on the network side that are actually based on earlier specs.
I see.
So the question is, you can't. Those aren't, because there's a non-backwards compatibility issue. There's a chance that your communications between the base station and the phone don't actually work.
Which would be not ideal.
Which would be bad. Yeah.
Yes. What about? I mean, like people like Ericsson are always going on about how it's really cool because their stuff's you can just update it with an OTA. Sort of patch and all that sort of thing.
So I asked the 3GPP about this. Do they provide support for upgrading to these latest specs? And they basically said that's not really anything to do with us. You'd have to ask the vendors. It's up to them to sort that out. And the vendors.
So this is a vendor. This is a vendor.
This is a vendor issue. So the vendors they obviously say that they acknowledge that they've got kit out in the market based on older specs, but they say it's something that can be handled with an upgrade, a software upgrade. But I talked to Nokia on the phone about it in some detail, and they did say, I mean, it seemed to be a bit of a dig at one of their potential rivals. They kind of said, well, you might have problems depending on how you've engineered your kit.
I see.
If your hardware and your software are too tightly integrated, then it might be quite difficult to make this upgrade. And then what happens is you're faced with the possibility of having to actually take out equipment that's already in the market and replace it. And that's the worry, because that's going to be fairly costly, and it could hold up service launches.
And you have you chatted to any other kit vendors or just Nokia so far?
Well, Nokia is the one we actually had on the phone. We've had feedback from Ericsson and Huawei, but they didn't want to talk on the phone about it.
Fair enough.
We've certainly had statements from them.
Well, I'm going to have lunch with them in a bit. Maybe I'll bring it up.
Yeah,
really ruin the lunch.
And it's the reason why it's something that we should sort of pay attention to, I guess, is because one major operator has flagged it, and they're concerned about it. So, and I can't obviously say who that is.
Yeah, no, this is obviously
background.
This is an ongoing thing. I thought it was worth flagging up because, firstly, fair play to you for actually sort of doing a bit of digging, a bit of proper journalism, and secondly, this could turn into a sort of big story, obviously within the narrow confines of our little vertical.
Yeah.
But that is what we do, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
it's one to keep an eye on. Yeah.
Yeah, and if something as fundamental as standards is to some extent broken, then that's existential crisis for everyone within telecoms. So yeah, well done on that. Okay, cool. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys. We've got lunches to attend.
What are you going to have? Steak?
What am I going to have for lunch? I don't know what's on the menu. I'm going to have to rush it a little bit because later on I'm going with Mrs. Telecoms.com to go and see Soul to Soul and the brand new Heavies in Milton Keynes. Not really my thing, but it is her thing. And so I'm only doing a half day, but I just remembered about this lunch, so I'm going to go along to that. I'm not even going to be able to get pissed, which is, that's not a proper lunch in my opinion.
Not a proper final lunch.
Yeah, and then go up and go and get funky later on. So there we go. All right. Sorry about that. All right, thanks a lot for listening, everyone. Make sure you join us for the next one.